Chair, Mr. Chair.
Chris Farfoy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Part 5 of this bill is a fascinating part, and I wanted to concentrate on Clause 15. But before I did that, I'd just like to pay tribute that we're into the 13th hour of this debate. And it feels a little telethon-like, because when you're doing something for the benefit of the whole country, it feels like fun. And I think at the end of the day, everyone will benefit, especially if Part 5 becomes part of this legislation. Because Part 5, Clause 15, looks to include new sections 17A and 17B into the Overseas Investment Act. Now, Clause 17 in the said Act is titled Factors for Assessing Benefit of Overseas Investments in Sensitive Land. And there is in Clause 17A that we would like to insert into that Act some criteria for approval of overseas investments in residential property. Now, I don't want to dwell too long on 17A, Mr. Chair, but I think it is relevant for me to pass through them quickly, just so people get a flavour of what kind of criteria there will be. 17A 1A is a good character test. 17.1B is essentially an immigration test to make sure that the people who could potentially invest in residential property would meet Immigration Act criteria. But the interesting clause with 17A1C3 is that the overseas investment will or is likely to increase the supply of housing in New Zealand as determined by the relevant minister under Section 17B. Now, before I get to Section 17B, Mr. Chair, I do want to point out what that says, the increase the supply of housing in New Zealand. Now, pointing to some of the concerns of the Honourable Michael Woodhouse around the relevance of Part 5 to this piece of legislation, I think it's quite simple to say that if you're increasing the stock of housing in New Zealand, if you're an overseas investor, then and you're looking after it in a systemic way, you're helping housing affordability. So that's why I think Section 17B is quite fascinating and should be something that any government that wanted to have a comprehensive housing plan should have in place. Because, Mr. Chair, 17B does again set out criteria for overseas investors in residential supply in terms of increasing the housing supply. Now, one of those criteria for the investment is that the investment in 17B2 A1 is that the overseas investment is in vacant land and that the relevant overseas investor is committed to building premises used or intended for occupation by any person as a place of residence. Now, in plain English, that is an empty plot of land that person who is investing in that from overseas is going to build houses for people to live in. Whether it be themselves or someone else, or both of those, that would increase the housing stock here in New Zealand, which would be a good thing for housing affordability. Now, if the Honourable Michael Woodhouse can't see the sense of that...
Order. There was a point of order on which there was a considered ruling, and the member, I should have pulled him up earlier, but he cannot go back to relitigating that area.
Thank you. But if the government can't see how that would be good for the supply, increasing the supply of housing for housing affordability, then I think they may need to rethink their plan. The second one is that the overseas 2CA2 is that the overseas investor exists in premises that are already existing and is committed to redeveloping that site to contain a greater number of places of residence. Now, again, in English, that might be that someone might buy a property that is a singular house. They may invest in that, and they may turn that into 5 or 6 flats, or subdivide that area and build more houses, therefore increasing the supply of housing, which again is good for housing affordability. And the third criteria, Mr. Chair, under 17B2CA3 is that the overseas investor is investing in an existing premise used or intended for occupation by any person as a place of residence that is not currently suitable for habitation, and the relevant overseas person is committed to redeveloping that site to make it fit for habitation. Now, again, Mr Chair, Dennis O'Rourke.